Okay, welcome everyone on this terribly rainy afternoon. I do really appreciate you coming out in this weather. I know it is not easy. My name is Heidi Davis, and I am from the League of Women Voters of St. Pete. And we are very honored to have been invited here to speak to you today. So we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson, and then we're going to look at some data. And so we are going to jump right in. This is our agenda for today. I'm going to introduce you a little bit to the League of Women Voters, what we do, and who we are. We're going to look at the history of voting legislation in the United States, which of course mirrors the legislation that we had here in Florida. And then we're going to zoom down into Florida and St. Pete and look at some of the goings on historically in this area. We're going to actually look at some data, so hopefully no falling asleep on me. And then we're going to talk about does my vote matter? Why don't people vote? And at the end, we will take questions. So if you do have a question, hold that thought, and we will definitely get to it at the end. So we're going to jump right in. The League of Women Voters, we are a nonpartisan organization. We are dedicated to defending democracy and empowering voters and educating voters, of course. We were founded in 1920 at the same time as the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was ratified. And here's kind of a fun fact, which I actually didn't know until I was doing some research. In 1976, the League actually sponsored the first televised presidential debates since 1960, and they won an Emmy Award. So I think that is pretty cool. And then, of course, they went on to host a series of these events in 76, 80, 84, and 88. And then after that, we see that stops because, of course, that's the rise of cable news networks, and that's when you see them sort of taking over that role. The League has their hands in a lot of different things. One of the things they do is they really work on protecting voting rights, working on expanding voter registration accessibility. So they had this really interesting campaign back in 1993 where they helped to pass a national legislation for, hi, welcome, go have a seat, National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Bill. Now, what the Motor Voter Bill did is it really increased voter registration because it made it super easy to register. You didn't have to just go to the supervisor of elections office. You could go to your motor vehicles office. You could do it online, and you could also do it at wonderful places like this at your public library. So the League was instrumental in getting that legislation passed. Now, there are 29 leagues of the women voters in the state of Florida. Our group right here in St. Pete has actually been in existence since 1939. We have over 400 active members, and we are actually one of the largest chapters in the United States, which is really cool, I think. So what is it we do? Well, obviously, we get out into the community. A big part of what we do revolves around voter services, and that is registering people to vote, helping them get their mail-in ballot, giving them educational materials, really getting them engaged in the voting process. How do we do this? Well, we go out into the community and we table at events. We table at MLK Day, the Collard Green Festival, Juneteenth, National Voter Registration Day, which is coming up next month, and events like St. Pete Pride, and many, many more events out in the community. We table at rec centers. We table at senior centers, high schools, colleges, anywhere where we can get out into the community. We hold candidate forums for municipal elections, and of course we do what we call Speakers Bureau presentations, and this here today is actually an example of a Speakers Bureau presentation where the library invited us to come out and speak to you here today. One of the things that I'm especially proud of is our nonpartisan voter guide, which is called Vote 411. And this is a guide that we produce for every municipal, county, state, and federal elections. So any election, you go out to vote411.org and you can find information to educate you on your candidates. We also do a lot of other things. One of the other things we've been active in is petition collecting for those citizen-led amendments that you see from time to time. So we really do touch every piece of the voting process. Okay, is everybody ready for a little American history? I know, the dreaded American history. This was really boring when you were in school, but now I find it fascinating. So, Declaration of Independence, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So, I know, it makes you want to sing the song from Hamilton, right? Well, we think, okay, this is a big step. We're all set, equal rights in the United States. We're good to go, right? Yeah, no. So what we find is that Americans were denied the right to vote based on race, gender, age, economic status, even where they lived. In other words, which colony they lived in. Some examples, there were 5 colonies that barred Catholic people from voting. And there were 4 colonies that actually barred Jewish people from voting. And of course, who also couldn't vote? Women. No women could vote. So this, unfortunately, kind of stays the status quo for about 100 more years. And we see no real changes start to happen until after the Civil War. And what we see at that time is the passing of the 15th Amendment. And what that does is that it gives all male citizens over the age of 21 the right to vote. And this is supposed to be now independent of their race, their color, their previous servitude, whether they own land or not, whether they're Protestant or not. So again, I'm thinking we're all good to go again, right? No, again, not so much. Because states, as a backlash, then said, okay, we're going to implement poll taxes to prevent the low-income people, whether they're people of color or white people, from being able to vote. They also was a tremendous amount of violence and protests at the poll places, which again sort of keeps people away from voting. And of course, still, once again, women still cannot vote. So we're going to move forward, another 50 years. And what we have is what you've heard this term, the women's suffrage movement. So we have the passing of the 19th Amendment, finally giving women the right to vote. Now, this really ended about 100 years of protests by women to try to get the right to vote. And what we saw is once this amendment passed, we saw that first election year that 8 million women turned out to vote. So that is a tremendous change in the population of people who vote. One small change that we have just a couple of years later has to do with our Native Americans. So in 1924, we see the passage of a law that now allows Native Americans to actually vote. And you'd think, well, that's sort of counterintuitive because, you know, they were kind of here first, but they did not actually have the right to vote. Unfortunately, once again, the states didn't really want that to happen, so they looked for a way to sort of stop that from happening. And what they did is say, well, they're not really citizens per se because they don't live on U.S. land. They live on their own private reservations, so therefore they're not actually American citizens. So that's the purpose here. That's what this was supposed to fix, but it didn't, because what happened is because of this states being allowed to make their own laws, you had states where they were considered citizens, states where they were not considered citizens. It was not until another 40 years later, the passing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that finally Native Americans truly had the right to vote in all states. A little side note, in 1982, there was one more small piece of legislation where we see that voting ballots are now available in other languages, that if more than 5% of a population speaks a different primary language, that community has to provide a ballot in other languages. So that's when Native Americans finally got a ballot in Native American. And that also is when you see Spanish ballots start to come into play. Now, the big one, the most famous one probably that you're all familiar with, is the 1965 Civil Rights Act for the voting rights. No state or political subdivision may deny or abridge the right to vote of any citizen of the United States on account of race or color. So again, this is in the 60s, big civil rights protests. We're all aware of this. So this was a really, really big deal, because up to this point, what you still saw going on in the United States was unreasonable purging of voter rolls. You saw Black people being told that they had shown up to the wrong polling place, or that they showed up on the wrong day or the wrong time. Really crazy stuff. They had to recite the entire Constitution, which I don't know about you, but I definitely can't do that. They had to prove they were of good moral character. I'm not even sure what that means. And then in some cases, they had to bring another registered voter with them to vouch for them. So this law finally really put an end to that. And after that was passed, we see a tremendous increase in voting in the South. And this is one example. In Mississippi, the voter turnout in 1964 was 6%. And 5 years later, it went from 6% to 59%, just because of this legislation. So I cannot overemphasize the significance of this act. One more little small change that took place in 1971 was changing the age from you had to be 21 to vote to you only had to be 18. So why, after all of these hundreds of years, did this finally happen? Well, it has to do with World War II. In World War II, Congress lowered the age of being drafted from 21 to 18. So why does that matter? Well, all of a sudden you have 18-year-olds being shipped off to war, maimed, killed, whatever, by Congress, authorized by Congress, but they actually didn't even get to vote for the people in Congress. So that's a little bit weird. So finally, you see the rise of this really pretty famous slogan, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. It's pretty common sense. It really became the mantra of the youth movement, starting from the civil rights era, going forward, really peaking during the Vietnam era, because this was, obviously a lot of young people protesting the Vietnam War. So that's when you finally see the voting age dropping to 18. So, we've really looked at the United States as a whole. We're going to zoom down to what's happening here in Florida and in South St. Pete in our community. So we're going to look at how sort of we broke down some barriers in this community. And I realize we have a long way to go, but this is just a microcosm of what was going on. So in St. Pete, as well as the whole state of Florida, primaries were historically restricted to whites only. And this was actually true in 8 other states in the United States, so not just Florida. And it wasn't until 1944 that the Supreme Court actually said, yeah, that's not legal. And I did find this really cool picture from the front page of the St. Pete Times showing the little white primaries. So it really did happen, and that's from the cover of a newspaper in 1921. Prior to the Civil Rights era, of course, blacks did not serve in leadership roles in the city council, the judiciary, or on the school board in St. Pete, or any other area really of Florida. And like many other public spaces, Black people were not allowed to sit on St. Pete's famous green benches. I know that's not in color, but those are the famous green benches. And they were actually finally removed during the Civil Rights era in the 60s. So here are two super fabulous people. That's the only thing I could think of to describe them. The Reverend Enoch Douglas Davis. He worked to end busing, school segregation, employee discrimination, win voting rights. He worked to open the city's public spaces, the beaches, the pools to the Black community. And here's a really old picture of him standing in front of the Bethel Community Baptist Church, which of course he was the pastor of. This picture, I can't believe I found this on the internet. It's super cool. It's her little slogan card. This is a picture of Betty Wimbish. She became the first Black person to be elected to the St. Pete City Council in 1969. And I don't know if you can read it too clearly, but she had this great, super fun campaign slogan: "Don't just wish, vote Wimbish." So kudos to her as a woman in the 60s, getting out there. So super cool, I think, as a woman. Some other groundbreaking folks in our community. 1981, we see David Welsh, that's a picture of him here, becomes the second Black council member. And yes, he is the father of Mayor Ken Welsh. Next, no real movement until 1997. Frank Peterman Jr. is elected to the St. Pete City Council. 2000, we see Ken Welsh becomes the first Black person from St. Pete to be elected to a county level position, to Pinellas County Commissioner. And then, of course, in 2021, to become the mayor of St. Pete. I don't want to forget the women, the fabulous women who helped break the color barrier in St. Pete. In 2015, we have Lisa Wheeler Bowman elected to the St. Pete City Council. And in 2020, Deborah Figgs Sanders also elected to the St. Pete City Council. So again, kudos to the women. Now, seems like I talked a lot about all this great legislation, right? So we should be totally set with voter access, right? So raise your hand if you think we're totally set with voter. Yeah, nobody's raising their hand. Yeah, I know. It's not good. So this is some recent stuff that's going on that's really trying to sort of put up more barriers to voter access. So we're going to touch base on these. In 2021, the Florida legislature passed a law named SB 90. And what this did is it changed how often you have to re-request your mail-in ballot. It used to be you only had to do it every 4 years. Now you have to do it every 2 years. So if you want to get a mail-in ballot, your request expired this January. So if you haven't yet done it this year, you actually can do it here today, either with us or at the SOE, who's around the corner in this building today. So make sure you do that. So that was really making it harder for people who don't have access to go to the polls to continue to be able to vote and get their mail-in ballots. Another big change in 2023 had to do with third-party voter registration organizations. Now you're probably going, what the heck is that? Well, the League of Women Voters is an example of a third-party registration organization. We go out into the community and we register people to vote. There are lots of other community groups that do the same thing. Well, this law put up quite a few legal barriers for us. So as a result, we, along with other organizations, are no longer able to collect paper voter registration forms from people when we go out into the community. We have a workaround, but it's a complex workaround. So this law really did make it more difficult for community groups to help people register to vote. This Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act that is currently working its way through Congress, it is a biggie. So we're gonna play a little game in a minute, but I'm gonna tell you a little bit about this first. What it would require is for voters to prove that they are American citizens by potentially having to show a passport or certified birth certificate. Now, when you think, okay, well, that makes sense. I really don't want non-citizens to be voting. But it is already, today, currently, a felony for a non-US citizen to vote. That's already law. So this is not changing it. It's just making it more difficult for you to register to vote. So we're going to play a little game. I want you to raise your hand. No, there's not too many women in here. This is kind of towards women, but raise your hand if you use your spouse's last name, like on your driver's license, okay? And then also raise your hand if you don't have, and this is for everybody, if you do not have a certified birth certificate, copy of your birth certificate, because I know I don't. So if your hand is up, what that means is you don't really have a way to register to vote because you can't prove who you are. Your name on your birth certificate, like in my case, Heidi Rosenthal, is not the name on my driver's license, which is Heidi Davis. So I would have to have a passport to prove who I am. Now, I'm lucky I happen to have a passport, but otherwise you'd have to go and get a passport. So this is really a way to make it very difficult to register, to potentially register to vote. So we're hoping this doesn't make its way through Congress, but it remains to be seen. The next one is very much in the news today. Everybody heard about what's going on in California and Texas with the redistricting. We can call it redistricting. We can call it gerrymandering. It becomes gerrymandering when it's done purposely to change the political outcome of a race. That's gerrymandering, and it is not legal to gerrymander. We had a lawsuit in Florida, and in July of 2025, the Florida Supreme Court actually upheld the congressional map that did eliminate the black district that we had in our 2024 election. So that is unfortunate. And of course, like I said, we have more of this potentially happening in Texas and in California. So what can we all do? What power do we all have? Well, you got to stay informed. There's nothing more important than staying informed. Most basic thing, read your local newspaper, okay? I read the St. Pete Times or Tampa Bay Times. This information is in the newspaper. Other ways that you can interact, you can follow voting rights and advocacy groups like the League of Women Voters. We have all kinds of social media. We have a website. Groups like the ACLU, Common Cause, and the NAACP. These groups have their fingers on the pulse of what's going on, and I encourage you to interact with them. All right, here's the painful data part. Sorry, guys. This is voter turnout data for the last 4 general elections, okay? The trends overall that we're going to look at are good, but wow, so much room for improvement out there. If we look at Florida as a whole, we see turnout going from 72, 75, 77, 79%, right? So voter turnout going up. Great, that's fabulous for the state of Florida. You see that whole same trend in Pinellas on the second line, not actually slightly better than Florida as a whole, which I think is really cool. I also broke it down for Pinellas between male and female. And what you'll find is on average, women are actually turning out at 3 points higher than men. So men, I expect to see you vote next.
No problem.
I'm just telling you. Next, we're going to drill down to South St. Pete specifically. So in South St. Pete, what you see here, it's on this row, you see good trends, right? Actually, a little bit better than the state of Florida as a whole. So great trends overall, up to 77% in the most recent general election. When we start drilling down by race is where I have concerns. The white population you see is actually above the average, But the Black and Hispanic population, the Black population is coming in 10 points below, and the Hispanic about 4 points better. We have got to do something about this. So I want you to raise your hand if you know someone in your community that you can talk to about the importance of voting. Yeah, right? Okay. So let's get out there. Let's move the needle on this number. Another interesting thing, if you think that it's just a race where you see disparities, it's actually not. The worst disparities are actually by age. So the over 65 population, we vote, oh wait, I'm not actually 65 yet, okay, but close. We vote around 72% voter turnout. This is the US numbers as a whole. But look at the 18 to 24 group. That's the black bar on the far left. 44% turnout in the last election. That's like half of the over 65. That is a crazy disparity. If the percent of 18 to 24-year-olds voted at the same rate as the 72 plus, there would be 8 million more votes in an election. 8 million. That changes the outcome of every single election in the United States. So, who knows someone in the 18 to 24 age group they can talk to about getting out there and voting? All right, do it. Let's get them engaged. Does my vote really matter? Because, right, that's what I hear all the time. Oh, I'm just one vote. What's one vote? It's not going to make a difference. Well, if you look at the US presidential election, the number of points between the two top candidates, only 1.5%. This last presidential election was so amazingly close, it's crazy. If you had those 8 million votes, guess what? The election comes out totally different. Some examples here in Florida, the 2000 presidential race, 500 votes and change. The 2018 governor race in Florida, 32,000 votes and change. 32,000 sounds like a big number. What is that in percent? Less than 1/2 of 1%. That's how close that race is. The 2018 Senate race, 10,000 votes. What is that percent-wise? 1/6 of 1%. These elections, your one vote, I can't stress enough, totally matters. And getting back to that age discrepancy we saw, in Florida, we graduate 200,000 seniors every year. So we have 200,000 young adults moving into the voting system every year. 90% of them are already registered to vote. Why? Because of the Voter Motor Act. They are registered to vote when they get their driver's license. We've got to get these people out and voting, and we've got to get them engaged. So again, why don't people vote? They don't feel represented. They think their vote doesn't count. They're too busy. Difficult registration requirements. The lines are too long. They don't like the candidates, or they have trouble getting to the polls. Well, half of these go away if you just get a mail-in ballot. So just get your mail-in ballot. And I think, not to beat a dead horse, but I think I've proven to you that every vote actually does count. So we're going to wrap up our presentation today with this amazing quote by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves, and the only way they can do this is by not voting. Boop, mind blown. And you know what? I'm going to make you all say it with me. We're going to say this again all together because I want you to put this in your heart and put this in your head. Okay? So let's do it all together. Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves. And the only way they can do this by not voting. Yay! Thank you. That was great.